Our plan was to go straight to the biological weapons laboratory after moving through the Chinese-North Korean border. But our plans went quickly awry when dozens of North Korean soldiers ran by in their brownish-gray uniforms. We were coming out of the watchtower, and thankfully we were far higher up in the mountains than the soldiers winding their way up the dirt road below. They only had one car, and the rest tried to run next to it. The car billowed out black smoke and gave the entire surrounding area a smell of burning and sulfur. All the soldiers I could see were extremely thin, with sunken eyes and prominent cheekbones. They looked like they hadn't seen a good meal in years, and since this was North Korea, they probably hadn't. But they were still armed and far outnumbered us. We were supposed to use stealth to complete the mission, not raw force. A North Korean informant had given us the code to enter the biological weapons facility, and we would be entering at the slowest time of day, when the fewest staff members are present. We would still have to kill any guards we encountered, however. Change of plans. Agent Hudson said, pointing to a deer trail that wound in the opposite direction of the approaching North Korean troops. There's a small border town nearby where we can hide temporarily, until the military clears off the road. There's no other way? Not that I know of. Our planned route follows that road. We could lay low for a couple hours, then come back and check the area. Try not to be seen by any civilians, though. They're all spies for the regime. These people turn on their own neighbors for an extra bowl of rice. Hell, half of them are eating snakes and rats and grass just to survive. They probably earn $1,000 a year at most. They would bring us right to the torture chamber if they caught sight of us. Yeah, I figured. So, are we just not going to talk about what we saw back there? Agent Hudson stopped suddenly, giving me a severe look. His blue eyes looked me up and down coldly. Okay then, talk about it. He said, the statement caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond to it. Well, I mean, you have more experience than me. I was just wondering what you thought. I said, the trees around us rustled in the slight mountain breeze, the air smelling sweet and clean. I looked past Agent Hudson and could see for dozens of miles into the North Korean countryside. Quaint small villages dotted the landscape, with dirt roads snaking their way through the trees. Far off in the distance, from the direction of the watchtower, we heard yelling, and from a different direction, dogs started barking. Ah, shit. Let's pick up the pace. They have tracking dogs, I think. I don't know if they'll pick up on our scent and follow us, or whether they'll catch the trail of whoever actually did that horrible crap, skinning that man alive and all that. But our trail is fresh, so I'm not liking our odds. He began to speedwalk, pulling out the electronic compass and reading it as he went. From our view high up on the mountain, I could see a little town not far away. Agent Hudson did too, and he quickly pocketed the electronic compass. Okay, I know where we are. Don't need that anymore. So, are you going to answer my question? I asked. He walked fast beside me, breathing hard, a slight sheen of perspiration showing on his face. I don't have an answer for you, Jintao. Do you think I know everything strange and unusual we'll encounter just because I've been doing this job a few years? But no, I don't know what's going on. I've never seen anything like that before. And I hope, for both our sakes, that we never see it again. What do you think about what Al said? About biological and chemical weapons? Do you think maybe they tested out some new agent and it got out? I think the most likely answer is that man we saw wasn't actually dead. He might have looked dead when we first got there, but I seen lots of people who looked dead and weren't. Even being skinned alive, you can live for a while. Maybe he was in a stupor or a catatonic state from all the pain and shock he must have suffered. Maybe they gave that soldier some drug or chemical agent so he couldn't feel the pain. But it's not like we saw Lazarus rising out of the grave. In my book, all we saw was a dying, crazed man nailed to the wall. He stopped speaking, the dogs sounding much closer now. We had almost made it to the village. It looked fairly empty, though I saw a feral-looking, extremely skinny cat skulking around a nearby residence. As we entered the town, I realized just how dilapidated and shoddy the small houses and huts here looked. The one on the edge of the forest, with the cat in the yard, literally had holes in the roof, and the windows were broken and covered over with paper. No power lines ran to any of the houses. I thought to myself how cold and miserable the winters must be here without electricity or central heating. As if on cue, an old woman came hobbling out of the house, stooping down to pet the cat. She looked tiny, no more than 5 feet, and had an old-fashioned red satin dress covering her thin, shaking frame. She looked up at us with bleary eyes, the whites looking like yellowed jelly. She had a hunchbacked look, and took small, tottering steps as she leaned heavily on her wooden cane. After staring at us in surprise for a few long moments, she smiled, showing her few remaining teeth spread out in her mouth like lone sentries scattered across a war zone. "Are you with the tour group?" she asked in Korean. I immediately answered, smiling. "Yes, we got separated, I'm afraid," I said. She gave me a suspicious look, then she motioned for me to come inside the house. "Well, come in, and I'll get you food and water. Maybe we can find a way to get you back to your group." "That would be wonderful," I said. Agent Hudson understood some Korean, but not much. I translated the conversation for him, and he grunted in assent. "I'm not eating any of this damn North Korean food. It's probably all cats and dogs. Did you know the North Korean government put up posters all around the towns saying to eat dog meat in the summertime because it cools you down? In reality, they just wanted free food for their people. And slaughtering wild dogs is one more way to give it." I followed the old woman through the battered, cracked front door of the house. Inside, I saw a home that only someone in extreme poverty could love. A dirty, chipped table stood in the middle of the kitchen. A fire roared in the collapsing fireplace. Most of the bricks that composed it were either loose, fractured, or missing entirely. Above the fire, I saw a black metal pot. There was an odor of rotting wood and mold. I also smelled something strange coming from the pot. A smell almost like green tea. I walked over and looked in, inhaling deeply. In the boiling water, I saw only grass clippings and a dead snake, being cooked together for a disgusting broth. I looked up sharply at the woman, who didn't seem to notice my revulsion. "You eat this?" I asked the old woman, who smiled wanly.
When we can catch snakes or rats to eat, we do. Otherwise, it's just grass and rotten cabbage from the government, along with powdered milk sometimes or rice. But you can't count on the rations coming in. They've been cut, and then cut again, until we feel constantly hungry.
"What's your name?"
Eugene,
she said, bowing curtly. I wondered whether this woman was a friend or a liability. I certainly didn't want to kill her, and I also didn't want to risk her running out to inform the authorities of our presence immediately after we left. I could see the same thoughts passing through Agent Hudson's mind, his face turning stony as he looked down at her. "I'm Jinto, and this is Mark," I said, purposefully not giving her our full names. "Have you seen anything strange around here lately? We found a corpse in the woods that appeared to be not fully dead." Her eyes widened at this, and she uttered a short gasp.
we had that during the arduous march, the famine that killed millions. Some of the people who starved came back, and they were rabid, biting, totally insane. Nothing was left of their humanity. They were just agents of hunger who went around eating the living.
"And what about the line, 'And I looked and beheld a pale horse'? Have you ever heard that before?" I asked. She broke eye contact, looking down into the left, hesitating for a long moment.
No, I'm sorry.
In North Korea, Bibles could get you a death sentence or life in a concentration camp. So I doubted if she would have known the reference anyway. But something in her demeanor suggested that she knew more than she had said. I wondered if this was just paranoia from seeing the stressful situation, or whether I was actually seeing it. As I relayed the conversation to Agent Hudson in full, I heard dogs barking outside and men calling orders. The heavy thud of many booted feet echoed from the dirt road through the village. Before I knew what was happening, I saw Agent Hudson take out his tranquilizer gun and shoot a dart into her stomach. She looked down, confused, then frowned. Within seconds, she began to waver on her feet.
"Oh,"
she said, falling. Agent Hudson scooped her up in his arms as the knocks came from the front door, loud and incessant. Soldiers yelled in Korean, stating that enemy agents had infiltrated the area and a search was underway. Agent Hudson ran to the bedroom, throwing the woman down on the threadbare mattress. I heard crashing from the front and back of the house, and heavy boots began to thud on the wooden floors. Without thinking, Agent Hudson and I took refuge in a closet in the bedroom, shutting the door quietly behind us, though leaving a slit to see outside. And we waited for the men to come in and discover us with guns drawn and take us to the torture chamber. I heard the soldiers sweeping the house from room to room, dogs furiously barking outside. A car that sounded like its muffler had fallen off sometime during the Vietnam War idled on the street. They found the old woman laying comatose in her bed and tried unsuccessfully to rouse her, screaming orders at her over and over with no response. I heard footsteps coming towards the door of the closet where we hid, and my finger tightened on the trigger. I was resolved to go down fighting, and not be captured and given a slow death on a blood-stained concrete slab in the basement of some building where the townspeople never go. I saw Agent Hudson's eyes narrow, the scope of the gun raised to chest height as he prepared to start shooting. The air felt electric with tension, and I tried not to even breathe too loudly, lest we be heard. My heart beat furiously in my ears, each thud seeming to betray my presence to the enemy. I tried to calm myself, to stop the trembling that swept across my body. But then a commotion started on the street, and the soldiers began issuing orders and rushing outside. Someone started firing, and screams of agony and horror shattered the small, poverty-stricken town. I slowly opened the door, expecting some sort of trap. But the shrieking wails coming from outside could not have been staged. There was too much pain in the voice. Intolerable. It sounded like their vocal cords would rupture from the effort. And then, the screams were cut off, one by one. I walked softly to the window, seeing Heejin still laying on the bed unconscious. I would have to give her a dose of an opioid antagonist to prevent a likely overdose that would cause her to stop breathing and turn blue. For drugs like etorphine, we carry a preloaded red syringe that read, "Revive on, for animal use only." I wanted to laugh when I first read it, but the CIA had assured me that etorphine was the safest and quickest method of immobilization, and that this was an antidote that would work on humans as well. As I got to the window, seeing the cracked glass panes and ancient splintering wood, a sudden urge to turn away came over me, and I began sweating heavily. Chills ran up and down my body, and I felt unreal, not in the moment. It felt like I had just woken up in the middle of a dream. But when I looked outside, I knew my mind could not have conjured such atrocities in the course of a nightmare. On a white skeletal horse sat a red rider. His body twisted and dark. His features demonic and inhumane. The hooves softly clicked on the dirt and stones as the man rode over bodies. Their faces frozen in horror. It seemed like I was looking at something not from the angles and geometry of our universe, as if space itself twisted around this horrendous being of power. Its massive head formed the shape of an upside-down triangle. Its crimson skin as smooth as fresh paint. Two bulbous, glistening eyes stared out straight ahead, unblinking. They looked like two spherical obsidian stones, as large as baseballs and seemingly without eyelids. They looked insectoid, or even entirely alien. Like the eyes of a poisonous snake, they radiated malice and power. Underneath, it had some strange exoskeleton. Its bones on the outside of its body grooved and smooth, like a red shell rippling down its thin chest. Its legs jutted out the sides of the undead horse, like the legs of a praying mantis, sharp and muscular. The horse despite having no flesh or muscle on its body, moved quickly. It had 2 pure black eyes, like those of its master, though not nearly as strange. They didn't form a bulbous, spherical mass like those of the riders, but looked like 2 black stones embedded into its skull, shining with oil spot rainbows and colors that glimmered off its eyes as they caught the sun. A North Korean man ran across the street, and the rider on the horse pointed a long, festering finger in his direction and uttered a single word. The man stopped immediately, his eyes widening, the blood draining from his face. He began to claw at his own eyes, ripping them and shredding them until blood streamed from the sockets and 2 empty, lidless voids stared out. He began to choke and turn blue, as if he had swallowed his own tongue, and fell to the ground, seizing and kicking. I saw his fingernails and lips becoming cyanotic, and he laid on the dirt, as limp as a rag doll. As if in response, the creature on the skeletal horse gave out a deafening demonic shriek. It echoed across the mountains, reverberating in eerie waves. The voice sounded like thousands of voices spliced together, some simultaneously fading out while others rose in a harmonizing cacophony. It made a nightmarish sound, and goosebumps rose on my skin as I listened to the cry of this creature, a cry as alien and inhumane as anything I had ever heard. I realized Agent Hudson was no longer standing next to me. He had the red syringe in his hand, injecting some of the Revivon into Heejin's neck. Her breathing seemed slow, far too slow for comfort, and her face looked pale. But within seconds, her breathing began to accelerate, and her eyes started to flutter. With a confused, sleepy expression, she opened her eyes, seemingly not realizing where she was or how she got there. Agent Hudson looked up, motioning for me to come over. I looked out the window. I saw countless bodies on the road. Men, women, and children, all laying haphazardly next to one another. The creature had stopped its incessant demonic screaming, but the echoes still came back over the mountains, slowly dying down over a few seconds. My ears rang from the intensity of it, a high-pitched buzzing that made it hard to understand Agent Hudson's words. I listened intently, looking at his lips. She knows something, he said, his eyes cold and slitted. We need to find out what's going on here. I think it's something far worse than we imagined. I heard the distant clicking of the horse's hooves as it passed down the street, trampling the dozens of corpses on the way.
Oh, no. I knew it.
Heejin said woozily, her head spasmodically moving from side to side. Her eyes, wide and full of terror, looked up at the ceiling as she lay on her ancient bed. Agent Hudson looked at me. Your Korean is far better than mine. She will trust you more than me, simply because you know the language and look like her. I'll give it a shot. I pulled up a rickety chair, continuously glancing out the window, but the strange rider had passed by. He no longer screamed, and the silence outside seemed deathly. The smell of blood hung heavy in the air, coming through the cracks and broken windows of the dilapidated house. "Heejing," I said, pulling up close to her. She moved her head on the pillow, meeting my eyes. They were wide and very dark, filled with nightmarish memories and terrors that I couldn't imagine. What happened during the arduous march? What caused the bodies to come back?
We don't know where it started, but it seemed to come from the forest north of here.
I looked knowingly at Agent Hudson, who nodded. That was where the biological weapons facility we had been sent to investigate was located, directly north as the crow flies, not more than 3 or 4 miles from this town. And what was it?
The undead. But not just them. They followed something inhumane, something that rode by on a horse. I never saw it, but I heard stories from survivors. They said its horse shone a pale color, made of bones, with pure black eyes, like those of its master. The military told us it was a monster sent by the Americans or the South Koreans, and that our great leader, Kim Il-jung, would respond in force by sending 1,000 monsters to their countries for every one that invaded ours. But others whispered that it was made by the Democratic People's Republic itself, though they would never say it publicly, for fear of execution.
And how did it end? When the famine ended, the corpses and the rider went where? She shrugged.
The Chinese sent reinforcements to the border regions, and the DPRK began to fill every town around here with soldiers. Most of the Korean soldiers were starving just like us, and they would take our food by force, whatever little we had. If anyone was caught hoarding more than a couple meals worth, they would be publicly executed. I spent that time foraging in the forest for herbs and mushrooms, and trying to capture small game, even eating rats and mice I caught in traps. I avoided the town as much as I could after I saw the first of the dead rise to life. It seemed to last forever, but then one day, the soldiers were gone, and the food began to come back in slowly. We were given rice, and then bread, and the arduous march came to an end, with millions of our comrades dead. It was so bad back then, you couldn't leave the bodies of your loved ones out. They had to be buried immediately after death, otherwise you'd come back and find their bodies gone, or meat cut out from the legs and arms. Cannibalism ran rampant, and people ate grass and dirt just to fill their stomachs.
But you're still eating grass. I pointed out. She smiled sadly.
Only once a day now,
she said, as if that made it acceptable. And in these hellish conditions, maybe it was. I had immense respect for this old woman, who had survived such hardship and starvation and seen such horrors unleashed. How come none of this ever got out? No one in the rest of the world knows anything about the dead rising during the famine. We know that millions of people starved, but even finding out how many was impossible.
What happens here stays here, with our people. It's our burden alone. Living here is like living in a reinforced fortress, with no one allowed to leave or communicate with anyone outside. Anyone who tries to leave is shot on sight. The police make sure you know the consequences of trying to leave, or communication with the outside world. They say no one wants to leave because we are the greatest society in the world, the most equal and the most feared. No one would attack us, and that's why I think maybe it came from our own people.
I was about to respond when I heard the cracking of twigs and brush moving right outside the window. Moving quietly to the window, I looked outside. The rider was gone, but now a horde of walking corpses streamed into the town. They had blood coming from their mouths, their noses, their eyes, streaming yellowish, viscous fluid out their gaping wounds that ran down their bodies. Deep gash marks, bullet wounds, or marks of torture shone on their bodies, revealing bones and ligaments and gore underneath. A horrific sight that sent waves of fear through my body. The smell that came with the wave felt like a solid wall of fetid rot. An odor so thick I could taste it, and I nearly retched. Like rotten cheese decomposing tomatoes and rancid meat. That smell emanated out of the hundreds of corpses that gnashed their mouths, chewing the air constantly. Their bloody eyes stared like dolls' eyes, blank and lifeless in their sunken faces. Most looked starved, and many were totally naked. Though, on some, rotting fragments of cloth still clung to their pale, lifeless skin. Yellow pus and mucus shone and glistened on their bodies as they moved forward. Hungry and fearless, an army that seemed to emanate from one large hive mind, coordinating their movements like birds in a flock. Heejin didn't see them, and, in her partial opiate stupor, she may not have heard the subtle movements. They didn't scream or shriek, unlike the rider, and they moved as silently as predators. Whatever few people still had life on the street began screaming again as their bodies got eaten alive. The corpses lunging forward at the human flesh on the street, falling upon it with powerful jaws. The screams were weak and panicked. The last gasps of dying men and women as they came back to a nightmare even worse than before.
Those who died during the famine came back. Mobs of walking, undead children who ate even their own parents and grandparents, though many were orphans by that point. The parents died, too, from starvation, and their bodies were often eaten by the townspeople. Many turned to cannibalism, and human meat was sold on the black market during the darkest times. Women used to prostitute themselves just to get a bowl of rice or a piece of bread. People would eat their own children and mothers, and strangers or even friends were killed for whatever little food they had.
The walking corpses turned their heads towards the house, like bloodhounds who just got a whiff of their prey. As she kept talking, they began to rise from the still bodies they fed upon, converging upon the front door. A stream of rotting flesh and gaping mouths who now knew we were here. Agent Hudson, time to go. He had seen it too, and we started sprinting towards the back door. Heejin didn't rise, and didn't seem to realize the danger. We had to save ourselves, and also had a mission to accomplish. One that seemed far more important than ever now. I had a sick feeling in my stomach as I left her behind, condemning her to a horrible and slow death. Agent Hudson smashed through the rickety boards of the back door without even opening it, splintering the wood in an explosion of adrenaline. I followed through the hole. Heejin began to scream in agony, and I quickly turned, seeing the frontmost corpses lunging forward and eating her from the legs and stomach. Her eyes rolled in pain and horror, shrieking like a banshee as blood gushed from dozens of bites. The undead in the back of the streaming crowd stopped, looking at me as I stood in the door. An M67 fragmentation in my right hand, round and blue as a robin's egg. I pulled the pin, throwing it in an overhand arc that flew past in a blur and bounced off the floor of the kitchen, rolling into the bedroom across from me. As I turned and ran, I saw Heejin's eyes, haunted, staring up at the ceiling, as blood streamed from her stomach and legs. She moaned and whimpered constantly, no longer having the energy to scream. The creatures ripped the flesh off with their teeth, swallowing huge chunks of her body without chewing. It was a sickening sight, and even a few months later, recalling it makes me feel sick to my stomach. Agent Hudson had reached the edge of the woods. I was now 30 feet behind him, and I sprinted as fast as I could to give myself distance from the explosion I knew was coming. I counted down in my head. 5, 4, 3, 2. But that was as far as I got. A flash of light exploded out of the house, sending splintered boards and pieces of drywall flying in all directions. I looked back and saw a red ball of fire catching the dry wood of the house in an instant. My ears rang from the ground-shaking roar of the grenade. I started to look forward again, but I tripped on a rock and went flying. I landed on the grass, hitting my head hard against the dirt. It only stunned me for a few moments, but as I lay there, still too close to the house for any peace of mind, I heard a new sound coming from the house. The corpses had started to make noises, but they didn't scream. It sounded like a bloodthirsty crowd moaning in agreement as some fanatical leader whipped them into a frenzy of mass murder. Or the cheering of Roman spectators in a coliseum seeing men slice each other apart. It sounded like hundreds of people enraptured, saying, Then, as the fire spread and the house quickly started to collapse in on itself, it faded into silence.